Today we will be exploring an example to determine whether or not an unprofitable department should be eliminated. Ellison Enterprises manufactures headphones and has 4 operating departments. Each operating department produces a different model of headphones. The following departmental income statements were created for the year. An analysis indicates that 40% of the cost of goods sold is fixed and 30% of the operating expenses are fixed. Management is concerned about the profitability of Departments 1 and 2, which both currently show a loss of $100,000. If the company eliminates a department, the variable cost for that department will be eliminated, but the fixed cost will have to be absorbed by the remaining departments. We need to decide if Ellison Enterprises should eliminate any of the departments. The first glance answer, without putting too much thought into it, is that Departments 1 and 2 should be eliminated, as they are both operating at a $100,000 loss. But we can't forget that the departmental income statements contain fixed costs that will be absorbed by the other departments after one department is eliminated. In other words, 40% of the fixed cost of goods sold and 30% of the fixed operating expenses are unavoidable and will exist whether or not a segment is eliminated. So getting rid of these 2 departments won't simply eliminate the $200,000 loss we are seeing. Some of the cost of goods sold and operating expenses will need to be absorbed by Departments 3 and 4 if Departments 1 and 2 are eliminated. Of course, if some of the fixed costs were avoidable, such as fixed salaries of workers that might be laid off, then those costs would be relevant. But for the purposes of this problem, we will assume that the fixed costs are unavoidable. So what is the best way to proceed? Well, we could prepare 3 additional sets of departmental income statements. One with Department 1 eliminated, a second with Department 2 eliminated, and a third with both Departments 1 and 2 eliminated to see what happens to total profit in each case. But there is a little bit more efficient way to go about things, and that is by preparing just one statement, calculating the total contribution margin for each department. Remember that the contribution margin is just the sales minus the variable costs, and it represents how much each department is contributing to increasing income. Any departments with a positive contribution margin should be kept, and any departments with a negative contribution margin should be dropped. The setup includes our 4 departments again, with the sales revenue just like we had previously. But now, instead of listing the entire cost of goods sold, we simply list the variable cost of goods sold. Our note tells us that the fixed cost of goods sold is 40%, meaning that the remaining 60% must be variable, since the percentages must add to 100%. 60% times each of the cost of goods sold values from the initial departmental income statements gives us the variable cost of goods sold. We can do the same thing for the operating expenses. 30% of the operating expenses are fixed, which means that 70% are variable. 70% of each of the operating expenses from the initial statement gives us the variable operating expenses. Finally, we can calculate the contribution margin by taking the sales and subtracting the 2 variable costs. Now, if we examine the contribution margins, we notice that they're all positive. You can think of the contribution margin here as the amount that net income would decrease by if the department was eliminated. So it should be very clear at this point that none of the departments should be eliminated. Elimination of any department would cause income to fall by a minimum of $900,000. Alright, that wraps up our example considering whether or not to eliminate a department.